The avoidant person genuinely wants to apologize to you. They want to acknowledge how their patterns hurt you, want to express regret about their behavior and about losing you, and want to take some responsibility for what went wrong. But they're paralyzed by fear of how you'll respond, terrified of the rejection or the anger or the indifference they might encounter if they reach out. They're scared that their apology will be dismissed, or that you'll tell them it's too late, or that you'll express just how much damage they caused in ways they're not emotionally equipped to handle. This desire to apologize, combined with fear of your response, creates internal conflict where they're simultaneously pulled toward reaching out and held back by anxiety about what will happen if they do. They compose messages they never send, rehearse conversations that never happen, work themselves up to contact you, and then back down at the last moment because the fear overwhelms the desire. The avoidant wants to apologize for multiple reasons. They're genuinely feeling guilt and regret about their behavior. They're recognizing in retrospect what they couldn't see during the relationship about how their patterns affected you. They're uncomfortable with the way things ended and they want some form of resolution or closure. They're hoping that apologizing might restore some possibility of connection or might ease the finality of your absence. They're seeking relief from the discomfort of carrying guilt without expressing it. But alongside this genuine desire to apologize is profound fear of how you'll receive their apology. They fear you'll reject their apology as insufficient or as too late. They fear that you'll use the opportunity of their vulnerability to tell them exactly how much they hurt you in ways that will be painful for them to hear. They fear that you'll be indifferent or unmoved by their apology, proving they don't matter to you anymore. They fear that apologizing will open a door to a conversation or connection that will trigger their intimacy anxiety all over again. They fear that you'll accept the apology, but make clear there's no possibility of reconciliation, leaving them with the discomfort of knowing they lost you permanently. They fear that you'll ignore their apology completely, leaving them in painful limbo of not knowing how you feel or whether you even care enough to respond. This fear is significant enough that many avoidants never actually deliver the apology they want to give. They remain stuck in the space between wanting to apologize and being too afraid to actually do it, carrying their guilt and their regret without expressing it because the risk of your response feels too threatening to their defended system. Why they want to apologize now when they couldn't before. The avoidant person's desire to apologize now, after time has passed and the relationship has ended, is motivated by different psychological states and different needs than existed during the relationship when they couldn't apologize or take responsibility. Understanding why they want to apologize now reveals both genuine growth and self-serving motivations that often exist simultaneously. They want to apologize now because time and distance have allowed their defensive system to relax enough that they can acknowledge their patterns and their impact without the immediate threat of intimacy that prevented acknowledgement during the relationship while you were together. Acknowledging their patterns or apologizing for their behavior felt threatening because it would create vulnerability and would invite more intimacy and more emotional engagement. Their defensive system prevented them from seeing their own responsibility or from expressing genuine remorse because these acknowledgments would have required them to be more emotionally available and more vulnerable. But now that you're gone, now that there's distance and the immediate threat of intimacy is removed, their defenses have relaxed enough that they can see more clearly what they couldn't see before. They can recognize their patterns as problematic, acknowledge how their behavior hurt you, and feel genuine regret about what happened. The safety of distance allows awareness and remorse that proximity prevented. They want to apologize now because they're experiencing delayed recognition of your value and of what they lost. Recognition that makes them want to express regret they couldn't express when they were taking you for granted. During the relationship, they focused on the discomfort your presence created, the intimacy, anxiety, the feeling of pressure, the threat to their independence. They couldn't fully appreciate what you provided because their defensive system was too busy managing perceived threats. But with time and distance, with the contrast of your absence versus your presence, with attempts to connect with others who don't compare to you, they're recognizing what they had and what they lost. This delayed recognition creates a desire to apologize not just for their specific behaviors, but for having failed to appreciate you, for having taken you for granted, for having let their patterns destroy something valuable. The apology they want to give now is acknowledgement of your value they couldn't acknowledge before. They want to apologize now because they're feeling guilt that has become uncomfortable to carry without expressing it, and apologizing would provide relief from this psychological burden. Guilt is an uncomfortable emotion that creates internal pressure for resolution. The avoidant is carrying guilt about how they treated you, about specific things they said or did, about their patterns that hurt you. This guilt weighs on them, affects their self-image, and creates discomfort they want to relieve. Apologizing would ease this burden by allowing them to express the regret, to acknowledge the harm, and to attempt to make amends. This motivation is partially self-serving. They want relief from their discomfort. But it also indicates genuine recognition of having done something wrong, which is important even if the primary motivation is managing their own feelings rather than addressing your pain. They want to apologize now because they hope the apology might restore some possibility of connection, or might keep a door open for a future relationship when they've done work on themselves. The apology is not just about expressing regret, but is also about attempting to restore some form of access to you, some possibility that isn't completely foreclosed. They hope that if they apologize, if they acknowledge their mistakes, you might soften toward them, might be willing to maintain some contact, might leave the door open for reconciliation if they change. This hope might be a conscious strategy, or might be an unconscious motivation underlying their desire to apologize. Either way, the apology is serving a purpose beyond pure expression of remorse. It's an attempt to manage the loss, to prevent complete finality, to maintain some possibility of having you in their life in some form. They want to apologize now because they're uncomfortable with how things ended, and they want closure or resolution that would make the ending feel less painful or less unresolved. The way things ended might feel abrupt or unfinished to them. There might have been harsh words or painful final interactions. There might be a lack of clear ending that leaves things feeling unresolved. The avoidant wants to apologize as a way of creating a better ending, of resolving the discomfort of how things were left, of achieving some sense of closure that would allow them to move forward with less discomfort. This motivation is about their comfort rather than about your healing, but it indicates they're affected by the ending and they want to address it in some way. They want to apologize now because they're hoping to ease their own abandonment wounds by proving to themselves that you don't completely hate them or completely want them gone from your life. The avoidance core wound is abandonment, and being in a position where they've been left or rejected activates this wound painfully. Apologizing and receiving any response from you, even acceptance of the apology without reconciliation, would ease this abandonment wound by proving you don't completely reject them. You don't hate them entirely. You can acknowledge their humanity and their regret. This desire for reassurance that they're not completely abandoned or hated is a powerful motivator for wanting to apologize, even if they consciously frame it as being about making amends to you. They want to apologize now because they've recognized through therapy or self-reflection that taking responsibility is part of their growth work, though this doesn't necessarily mean they have the capacity to be different in a relationship. Some avoidants who are doing genuine therapeutic work recognize that making amends is part of the healing process, that taking responsibility for harm caused is an important step in their development. Their desire to apologize might come from this genuine growth work, from recognition that they need to acknowledge their impact on others as part of addressing their patterns. However, this growth-motivated apology doesn't necessarily mean they've developed the capacity to sustain a healthy relationship. They might understand intellectually what they did wrong and want to take responsibility for it while still lacking the emotional capacity to show up differently in an actual relationship. The specific fears that keep them from reaching out. The avoidant person's fear of your response is significant enough to prevent them from actually delivering the apology they want to give, and these fears are specific and revealing both about their psychology and about their continued limitations. Understanding what they're afraid of illuminates why they remain stuck between wanting to apologize and being unable to actually do it. They're afraid you'll reject their apology as too late or insufficient, confirming their fear that the damage is irreparable and that they've permanently lost you. The avoidant has a catastrophic fear of rejection rooted in their abandonment wound. Reaching out to apologize makes them vulnerable to the specific rejection of you telling them their apology doesn't matter, that it's too late, that nothing they say can undo the damage they caused. This rejection would confirm their worst fear, that they've destroyed something that cannot be repaired, that they've lost you permanently through their own actions, that their patterns have consequences they cannot undo. The possibility of this confirmation is terrifying enough to prevent them from taking the risk of reaching out, leaving them stuck in an ambiguous space where the loss isn't completely confirmed but also isn't resolved. They're afraid you'll use their apology as an opportunity to tell them exactly how much they hurt you, forcing them to confront the full extent of damage their patterns caused. The avoidant knows they hurt you, but likely doesn't fully understand or hasn't fully confronted the depth and breadth of that hurt. If they apologize, you might respond by detailing all the ways they damaged you, by explaining the specific pain they caused, by making them sit with the full weight of their impact. This confrontation with the harm they caused is threatening because it would create guilt and shame that their defensive system is designed to avoid. They want to apologize and receive forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement, without having to fully face what they're apologizing for. The fear of being confronted with the reality of their impact keeps them from reaching out. They're afraid you'll be completely indifferent to their apology, responding with emotional flatness that proves you don't care about them anymore and that they don't matter to you. While rejection is painful, indifference might be even more threatening to the avoidant's sense of self. If they apologize and you respond with genuine indifference, you acknowledge the apology without emotion, you indicate it doesn't matter to you one way or another, you make clear you've moved so far beyond them that their apology has no impact. It proves they don't matter anymore. This proof of their irrelevance, of having moved from being important enough to hurt to being unimportant enough that even their apology doesn't create feeling, is devastating to their ego and their sense of being significant to you. The fear of discovering they no longer matter to you keeps them from taking the risk of apologizing. They're afraid that apologizing will open a door to conversation or connection that will trigger their intimacy anxiety all over again, creating the very discomfort their patterns are designed to avoid. If they apologize and you respond with openness to dialogue, if the apology leads to conversation about what happened or about feelings or about the possibility of reconciliation, the avoidant will find themselves in exactly the type of emotionally intimate situation that triggers their defensive patterns. They might want to apologize, but they don't necessarily want the emotional engagement that an apology might lead to. This creates an impossible bind. They want to express their regret, but they fear the intimacy that expressing it might create. This fear of triggering their own intimacy anxiety keeps them from following through on their desire to apologize. They're afraid you'll accept their apology, but make absolutely clear there's no possibility of reconciliation or future relationship, leaving them with the finality they're trying to avoid. The avoidant might be hoping, consciously or unconsciously, that apologizing could lead to some possibility of connection, some opening for a future relationship. They fear that you'll accept their apology graciously, but then definitively close the door on any future possibility, saying something like, "I accept your apology and I appreciate it, but I've moved on and there's no possibility of us trying again." This clear, kind finality would remove all hope and all possibility, forcing them to accept the permanent loss. The fear of this definitive closure keeps them from apologizing because as long as they don't reach out, they can maintain some ambiguity, some possibility, some hope that maybe someday things could be different. They're afraid of the vulnerability inherent in apologizing, of admitting wrongdoing, and of needing something from you in the form of your response or your forgiveness. Apologizing requires vulnerability, admitting you were wrong, acknowledging you hurt someone, expressing regret, potentially asking for forgiveness. This vulnerability is precisely what the avoidance defensive system is organized to prevent. Reaching out to apologize would require them to be vulnerable with you in ways they couldn't be during the relationship, to admit a need for your response or your forgiveness, to place themselves in a position where you have power through your ability to accept or reject their apology. This vulnerability feels too threatening, even though they want to apologize, because it requires lowering defenses in ways that feel unsafe to their system. They're afraid that you won't respond at all, that their apology will be met with complete silence that leaves them in painful limbo of not knowing how you received it or whether you even care. The fear of being ignored might be worse than the fear of a negative response, because silence provides no information, no closure, no resolution. If they send an apology and you don't respond, they're left wondering, did you read it? Did it affect you? Do you hate them? Are you indifferent? Are you considering a response? The uncertainty and the lack of control over the situation created by your potential silence is intolerable for the avoidance need for control and for information. The fear of being left in this painful uncertainty keeps them from taking the risk of apologizing. What their fear of your response reveals about their growth and limitations. The avoidant person's fear of your response to their apology, while understandable, reveals important information about their level of genuine growth versus continued limitation, about their capacity for vulnerability versus their ongoing need for control and safety. Understanding what their fear reveals helps you assess whether their desire to apologize indicates meaningful change or is simply another manifestation of their patterns. Their fear reveals they're still primarily concerned with managing their own comfort rather than with genuinely addressing the harm they caused you. A truly growth-oriented apology would be focused on acknowledging the harm, expressing genuine remorse, and taking responsibility regardless of how the apology is received. But the avoidance fear of your response proves they're still focused on how the apology will affect them, whether you'll reject them, whether you'll make them uncomfortable by detailing their impact, whether they'll get the response they want. This self-focus reveals that their desire to apologize is still organized around their needs and their comfort rather than around genuine consideration of your experience and your healing. True growth would involve being willing to apologize and face whatever response comes, because the apology is about taking responsibility, not about managing outcomes. Their fear reveals they're still unable to tolerate the vulnerability and the lack of control that genuine amends would require, indicating their defensive structure remains largely intact. Genuine apology and amends require accepting vulnerability. You don't know how the other person will respond. You can't control their reaction. You have to sit with whatever feelings your apology brings up for them and for you. The avoidant's inability to tolerate this vulnerability and uncertainty proves their defensive system is still operating in ways that prevent genuine intimacy and genuine repair. If they cannot be vulnerable enough to apologize without a guarantee of a specific response, they likely haven't developed the capacity to be vulnerable enough to sustain a healthy relationship. Their fear is evidence that the core defensive patterns that destroyed the relationship are still active. Their fear reveals they're hoping for a specific response that would ease their discomfort rather than being willing to apologize unconditionally without expectation of a particular outcome. The avoidant wants to apologize, but they want your response to be forgiving, understanding, not too detailed about the pain, and leaving some possibility open. They want the apology to create a specific outcome that serves them. Relief from guilt, some restored connection, reassurance they're not completely rejected. This expectation of a particular response reveals that the apology isn't truly unconditional, isn't genuinely just about taking responsibility. It's still transactional. They want to apologize and receive something specific in return. True growth would involve being willing to apologize because it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether you forgive them, whether you respond at all, or whether it creates the outcome they hope for. Their fear reveals they still view your potential honest response about their impact as a threat, rather than as information they need to fully understand the consequences of their patterns. If the avoidant were genuinely committed to growth, they would want to understand the full extent of how their patterns affected you. Even if that understanding is painful, they would view your honest account of the damage as valuable information that would help them understand why they need to change and what they need to work on. But their fear of hearing the details of how they hurt you reveals they still view your honest expression of your experience as a threat to be avoided rather than as information to be received. This proves they're not ready for the type of honest reckoning that genuine growth requires. They want to acknowledge harm in the abstract without facing the concrete reality of that harm. Their fear reveals their desire to apologize might be more about managing their own guilt and seeking closure for themselves than about genuinely supporting your healing. If the apology were truly about you and your healing, they would reach out regardless of fear because supporting your healing would be more important than their comfort. But their fear keeping them from apologizing reveals the apology is actually more about them, relieving their guilt, getting closure, easing their abandonment wound, restoring some possibility. This self-focus doesn't make their regret invalid, but it does indicate the apology would be serving them more than serving you, which is important to recognize if they do eventually reach out. Their fear reveals they haven't developed the distress tolerance and emotional regulation that would be required to engage in difficult repair conversations or to sustain a healthy relationship. Apologizing and dealing with the response is a relatively low-stakes emotional challenge compared to what sustaining a healthy relationship would require. If they cannot tolerate the distress of apologizing and facing an uncertain response, they certainly haven't developed the capacity to tolerate the ongoing emotional challenges of a relationship, having difficult conversations, sitting with conflict, managing disappointment, being vulnerable consistently. Their fear of this relatively small emotional risk proves they haven't developed the distress tolerance that relationship competence requires. Their fear reveals that even if they do eventually apologize, the apology itself isn't evidence of capacity to be different in a relationship, only evidence of delayed awareness of their impact. Some avoidants do eventually overcome their fear and apologize, but the apology alone doesn't prove changed capacity. It proves they've developed awareness and they've worked up the courage to express that awareness. These are important steps, but they're not the same as having developed the sustained emotional availability, the vulnerability tolerance, the communication skills, and the consistency that a healthy relationship requires. Their fear and their hesitation to apologize reveal how much work they still need to do to develop these capacities. Why their desire to apologize changes nothing about what you should do. The avoidant person's genuine desire to apologize, combined with their fear that prevents them from actually doing it, has specific implications for you and for how you should proceed with your healing and your boundaries. Understanding why their internal conflict about apologizing changes nothing about your path forward protects you from organizing your life around their potential apology or from making decisions based on hope rather than reality. Their desire to apologize changes nothing, because an apology they're too afraid to give is just potential energy that provides you nothing and creates no actual change. You cannot heal from an apology you don't receive. You cannot gain closure from words they're thinking but not saying. Their internal desire to apologize, no matter how genuine, has zero impact on your life if they never overcome their fear enough to actually express it. Organizing your healing or your decisions around the possibility that they might apologize someday is giving power to something that may never materialize. Your healing cannot depend on their apology. Your forward movement cannot wait for their courage. You must proceed as if the apology will never come, because waiting for it keeps you stuck. Their desire to apologize changes nothing, because even if they do eventually overcome their fear and apologize, the apology doesn't undo the damage or prove they've developed the capacity to be different. An apology is words. Words are important for acknowledgement and for taking responsibility, but words don't heal the wounds that behavior created. If they apologize, it might provide some validation that your pain was real and that their patterns were the problem, but it doesn't undo the damage to your trust, to your self-esteem, to your ability to feel safe in relationships. An apology alone doesn't prove they've changed. It proves they recognize they should have been different. But recognition isn't the same as developed capacity. You should not make decisions about reconciliation or about lowering your boundaries based on an apology alone without sustained evidence of behavioral change. Their desire to apologize changes nothing, because your healing and your worth are not dependent on receiving their acknowledgement or their validation. It would perhaps feel good to receive a genuine apology, to have them acknowledge their patterns and take responsibility for the pain they caused. This acknowledgement might provide some validation and some sense of justice, but your healing doesn't require it. You can heal without their apology. You can know your worth without their validation. You can understand what happened and can move forward regardless of whether they ever acknowledge it. Waiting for their apology to feel fully healed or fully validated gives them power over your recovery that they shouldn't have. Your healing is yours to create, independent of anything they do or don't do. Their desire to apologize changes nothing, because the fear keeping them from apologizing is evidence they're still operating from a defended place that prevents genuine intimacy and vulnerability. If they're too afraid to apologize, they're too afraid to be in a healthy relationship with you.